It was a Tuesday morning just after 7. The air still held that cool, honey-sweet stillness of early spring, and the scent of wild grass drifted through the open kitchen window while I stirred my coffee. I had just fed the chickens. The dog was dozing by the back door, and for a moment, life on the edge of the neighborhood felt exactly how I'd wanted it to feel when I moved here, quiet, unbothered mine. That changed the moment the ground began to shake. At first, I thought it was distant thunder. Then came the heavy crunch of tires on gravel, too many to be a delivery truck or a neighbor's SUV. I stepped out onto my porch, in boots and a bathrobe, the mug still warm in my hands. And that's when I saw them two HOA utility trucks, a rented flatbed, and most unbelievably, a full-sized drilling rig being guided up my gravel road by 3 orange-vested workers. I didn't move. I didn't have to. They were pulling right into my property, over the cattle gate I'd left open for the propane truck. They didn't slow down. They didn't ask. And before I could even finish my coffee, one of them was uncoiling cable near my barn, like it belonged to them. "What the hell are you doing?" I called out. One of the workers, young, probably mid-20s, sweat already blooming through his safety vest, looked up and blinked at me. "Water survey, sir. We've got authorization from the HOA board." "This is private property," I shot back. "I didn't authorize a damn thing." He shrugged. "Take it up with the board. We're just contractors." I stormed down the steps, my boots crunching over dry gravel, and demanded paperwork. A clipboard was handed to me like a consolation prize. It wasn't even a permit. It was a memo from the Oak Summit HOA board stating they were initiating a neighborhood-wide water table survey for future drought resilience. And in the margin, sloppily handwritten, was a line. "Includes undeveloped border parcels within emergency easement allowance." I didn't even need to read the rest. My land wasn't part of Oak Summit. I'd fought off 3 offers to buy it. I paid separate county taxes. I had an original land deed from the 1940s drawn up when this entire valley was nothing but scrub and cattle trails. But none of that seemed to matter. The HOA had taken it upon themselves to expand their reach quietly, unilaterally, and illegally. The drill fired up an hour later. A dull mechanical groan, at first then, a piercing whine that settled into the earth like a pulse. They set up near the southern fence line, right where my old well used to be. I watched them bore straight into soil that had never once belonged to them. And in that moment, I knew something was wrong, not just with what they were doing, but with the silence that followed. Because the board hadn't called. No notice had been delivered. No email, no letter, no knock on my door. They had come like they owned the place. Around 10, I finally reached someone at the HOA office, Nancy Tillman, their new environmental project liaison. I knew her vaguely. She wore pearls to town halls and had a brittle, know-it-all confidence that reminded me of bureaucrats I used to spar with in the service. She answered on speaker, her voice tinny and indifferent. "I'm not sure why you're upset, Mr. McCrae," she said. "This is for everyone's benefit. We're preparing for long-term drought conditions. This survey was voted on and approved unanimously by the board." "You didn't vote on my land," I snapped. "You don't own my land. And you damn sure don't have the right to drill on it." There was a pause. Then calmly, "We have the right under emergency environmental access provisions, which your property falls under due to its location on the aquifer map." "You should have received an email." I didn't. "Well, perhaps check your spam folder." I hung up. I didn't yell. I didn't threaten. I went inside, retrieved the leather binder where I kept my land deed survey maps and boundary markers. Then I made 2 calls, one to the county land office and one to Jack Perkins, an old friend from the days I worked state infrastructure back before I retired. Jack didn't ask a lot of questions, just said, "Text me the coordinates. I'll look at the water rights overlay this afternoon." By noon, the drill was about 30 feet down. I stood at the fence, arms crossed, watching them pump slurry into the borehole. They were too deep for shallow groundwater, which meant they were testing for something more substantial. The crew chief, a wiry man with a clipboard and a sun-scorched neck, approached me then. "You might want to move your livestock, sir. We'll be pressure testing tomorrow." "Get off my land," I said. He smiled like I'd made a joke. "We'll be done in 3 days." I walked back to the house and locked the gate behind me. That night, I emailed the county office again and requested a cease and desist review. I copied Nancy Tillman. I CC'd the board. No reply. But the next morning, something changed. The air smelled different, acrid, like boiled eggs and wet metal. I thought maybe the septic line was acting up until I stepped outside and saw it, the thin yellow sheen creeping from the borehole, and the silence. No birdsong, no rustling leaves, just the distant hum of generators, and a new, deeper kind of wrong humming from beneath my feet. The sulfur had risen, and none of them had any idea what they'd just unleashed. By the time I got down to the bore site that second morning, the air was thick with the stench of sulfur, pungent and unmistakable. The kind of smell that grabs your sinuses and doesn't let go, like the inside of a rotten egg cracked open on a hot sidewalk. The drill had gone deeper overnight, and now the ground oozed a milky yellowish froth around the hole. Steam lifted in faint, ghostly ribbons, and yet the crew kept working like nothing was wrong. They wore masks, now respirators, not the cheap paper kind. One of them, the young guy who'd first shrugged at me, had red eyes and was coughing into his elbow between shovel loads of wet, sludgy soil. I watched from the fence, my stomach turning as I saw him scoop the runoff into a black container with a hazmat label on the side. They were treating this like a minor inconvenience, not a biohazard, not a trespassing operation gone off the rails. I couldn't stay silent anymore. I walked down the gravel path past my pasture and along the fence line until I reached the gate they had cut. Not opened cut. The lock had been sawed through. A pair of bolt cutters lay just off the path, half buried in trampled grass. They hadn't even bothered to hide them. This wasn't just overreach. It was vandalism. It was criminal trespass. I climbed through the break in the fence and stepped into the field. Immediately, the sulfur hit harder, raw and unfiltered. It clung to the back of my throat and curled around my eyes. I pulled the collar of my flannel up over my face and pressed forward, boots sinking slightly into the muck. One of the contractors saw me coming and turned away, but the foreman didn't. He met me halfway, clipboard in hand, posture all puffed up like I was just some cranky old landowner making noise for no reason. "You're not authorized to be here," he said. "Neither are you," I shot back. "This is my land. I never gave you permission. You cut my gate. You drilled without permit. You're hauling out sulfur runoff without containment. Do you even know what the hell you hit?" He blinked, but his mouth kept moving. "We're under direction from the Oak Summit HOA Environmental Committee. They've coordinated this effort in compliance with regional drought mitigation." "Bull," I said. "There's no emergency declaration, no executive order. And this land isn't under your jurisdiction. I've got a deed and a county map that says so." He hesitated, just a flicker of doubt. "Then you'll need to take that up with the board." I already did, and I'm about done being ignored. That's when I pulled out my phone and started recording. "I want your name. I want the name of your company. I want the name of every subcontractor and who signed the work order. If you don't stop drilling right now, I'll have the sheriff here before lunch." He tried to knock the phone from my hand. I sidestepped and kept filming. His face flushed crimson, whether from embarrassment or fumes I couldn't say, but his hand dropped to his side and he turned away. That was the moment I knew he didn't have legal cover. They were operating in the shadows of authority, bluffing with technical language and half-truths. That afternoon, I drove into town. The sheriff wasn't in, but I left a written statement. Then I headed to the county recorder's office, where I sat down with an old, quiet woman named Linda I'd known since moving here. She pulled my parcel file and cross-checked the latest filings. There were no easements, no permits, no survey records, nothing. "They're flying blind," she said, flipping through the folder. "Trying to get you after the fact, maybe. Or just hoping you'd roll over." I didn't. Back at home, the sky had shifted. The clouds had thickened into a strange, dull bruise over the neighborhood. And from my property line, I could see wilted branches along the HOA fence rows. Not just on my side, but theirs. The HOA's manicured tree line, their prize-winning sugar maples, and ornamental ash were beginning to brown at the tips. One looked like it had dropped half its leaves overnight. It wasn't just sulfur fumes. The groundwater had started to turn. Late that evening, just as I was locking up the shed, my neighbor James came walking down the easement path between our lots. He was a decent guy, worked in IT, had 3 kids, and kept to himself mostly. But that night he looked worried. "Hey, Dalton," he said, eyes scanning the yellowing horizon. "You know what's going on with the trees? My backyard stinks like burnt eggs. My daughter's been throwing up since this morning." I told him everything. The drilling, the sulfur, the unauthorized crews. His jaw tightened. The HOA didn't mention any of that. Just said they were making progress on a community water access program. Progress, I scoffed. They're poisoning your soil. He stood in silence for a moment, then muttered, I should have voted no. You had a vote. Just last week. They said it was for drought resilience. Showed us a PowerPoint and said it was urgent. But they never said anything about drilling on your land. He turned to leave, then paused. Whatever they're doing, I don't think they can stop it now. He was right. The next day, the first tree inside HOA territory collapsed. A 20-foot dogwood planted for the development's 10-year anniversary split at the trunk and dropped into a neighbor's yard like a felled giant. The roots had rotted out black waterlogged and coated in that same sulfur slime I'd seen near the borehole. Still, the HOA said nothing publicly. They issued a brief statement in the newsletter calling it seasonal stress and advised residents to water less. Water less when the ground was soaked in sulfur-rich runoff. I printed that newsletter, highlighted the line, and tacked it to my wall. Then I called Jack again. This is bigger than a property dispute, I told him. They've contaminated the aquifer, maybe worse. Jack didn't hesitate. Send me everything, he said. Coordinates video water samples if you have them. I'll get someone from the state to look at it, quietly for now. That night, I collected 3 jars of groundwater, one from the bore site runoff, one from my old well, and one from the creek that bordered both properties. The differences were already visible. The creek had gone cloudy. My well water had a faint smell. And the bore site, it looked like someone had poured lemonade into a puddle of acid. I stored the samples in a cooler and labeled each one. Carefully. Precisely. Because if the HOA thought this was over, they didn't know me. I wasn't just fighting for land anymore. I was fighting to prove they'd trespassed, poisoned, and lied. And I wasn't alone. It was 3 days after the drilling started when the land began to rebel. It wasn't sudden, more like a slow, creeping sickness that spread in silence, as if the soil itself had begun to rot from within. The first real sign wasn't the dying trees or the sour water. It was the silence. Birds stopped nesting. The morning chorus that once woke me before sunrise vanished like it had been switched off. Even the insects disappeared. No crickets, no cicadas. Just the low mechanical hum of the drill, still going, still pumping something dark and foul from beneath my feet. That morning, I stood at the edge of my pasture, coffee in hand again, but it didn't taste the same. The wind carried a bite, now acrid and wrong. I looked out over the tree line where the HOA's development began, once bright and annoyingly pristine. Their signature row of red oaks lining the outer boulevard had started to discolor. The leaves curled at the edges and the bark turned patchy, like skin blistered from beneath. I counted 3 trees already losing half their foliage. This wasn't seasonal stress. It was chemical warfare from underground. I walked the perimeter with my dog Buck, who kept his nose low and tail stiff. He didn't sniff the grass like usual. He just moved like something was off. I knelt and dug into the soil, with my hand only an inch or 2 down. The dirt was wet and reeked of sulfur. It clung to my fingers like glue and left a yellow stain. I backed away and didn't touch my face. By mid-afternoon, a wind kicked up from the southeast and carried the stench deeper into the neighborhood. I watched from my porch as a mother and her child in the HOA subdivision walked their dog and suddenly stopped, both coughing, the child holding her nose. They turned back, retreating, and still the HOA said nothing. That night, I got a call from Linda at the county recorder's office. Dalton, she said, her voice low. I looked deeper into their filings. Yeah. There's a record submitted last week, backdated to make it look like it was entered a month prior. It references an emergency aquifer survey authorization, with an attachment that's conveniently missing, meaning someone's trying to make their drill operation look legal after the fact. I rubbed my temple. You think I can prove fraud? Not yet. But the metadata shows the form was edited the same day you called about the fence being cut. That was the opening I needed. The next day, I sent the footage I'd taken of the crew, the borehole runoff, and the broken gate to Jack. I bundled the videos with Linda's information, the newsletter screenshot, and the 3 water samples, then overnighted the whole package to the environmental lab Jack had connections with in Boulder. It cost more than I'd planned, but this wasn't about cost anymore. It was about the truth. By Thursday, more trees had collapsed, this time closer to the HOA clubhouse, their prized elm garden behind the tennis courts. 2 of the biggest elms in the neighborhood, each older than the development itself, fell within hours of each other. One of them tipped directly into a pergola where they'd host wine tastings. Snapped the whole thing in half. Residents started talking. One of them, Denise, who I used to chat with at the farmer's market, sent me a text. "Hey, do you know what's going on with the trees? The HOA said it's a fungus, but the smell is awful." I told her the truth, and I told her I had proof. Later that night, she replied with something that made my heart pound. "I'm on the landscaping committee. They told us not to speak publicly. Said messaging needs to stay unified. One guy quit over it." The HOA wasn't just ignoring the truth, they were suppressing it. Friday morning, I got a call from the lab. "Mr. McRae, we've got the preliminary results." "Lay it on me." The bore site sample shows extremely high concentrations of hydrogen sulfide and ferrous sulfates. The contamination likely stems from a breached sulfur deposit or degraded geothermal vent. "You said this was a water survey." That's what they claimed. Then they drilled far too deep and into the wrong strata. They've punctured something they had no business touching. And the other samples, your well is showing early signs of infiltration. The creek water is already compromised. I thanked the man, hung up, and just sat there on the edge of my bed for a while staring at the phone. Then I reached for my boots, pulled on my jacket, and stepped outside. The neighborhood was no longer the one I remembered. Where once everything was green and obnoxiously manicured brown patches now crept up lawns. Shrubs were drooping. The HOA had stopped irrigation 2 days earlier, blamed it on municipal repairs, but I knew better. They were trying to contain it. But sulfur doesn't contain. It seeps, it rises, it kills. Later that day, as I sat on my porch watching another tree drop across the HOA boundary line, a silver Mercedes pulled into my drive. I recognized the plate's HOA board member, Mark Fisher, VP of Operations. He stepped out in a blazer far too polished for the conditions and walked toward me like a man trying to control a narrative that was already on fire. "Mr. McRae," he said, "can we talk?" "You already are." He offered a tight smile. "We understand there have been some concerns. The board would like to work with you to address them." I stared at him. "Did you know you punctured a sulfur vein?" His smile faltered. "That's a theory. There's no conclusive." "I have test results. Independent lab. You contaminated the groundwater and killed half your damn trees." He exhaled sharply as if I was the one being unreasonable. "Mr. McRae, surely we can come to a civil resolution here. A landscaping crew could be dispatched to your property immediately. Compensation for the fence. Maybe a small stipend." I stood. "No," I said. "What you're going to do is shut down that drill. You're going to issue a public statement, and you're going to prepare for a full environmental investigation." His face went cold. "You'd rather take this to court." "No," I said, stepping closer. "I'd rather you didn't poison my land in the first place." He turned without another word and got back into his car. But I saw it before he drove off, the way he looked out at the wilting trees across the HOA boundary. For the first time, he looked scared. He should have been. Because the ground had turned sour. And it was only the beginning. The emails started that Sunday. They didn't come from a lawyer, not yet. No cease and desist, no formal complaints. Just a series of community wellness updates sent to the Oak Summit listserv and copied to me, even though officially I wasn't on their mailing list. The subject lines were vague and cheery. Addressing concerns, tree health, and spring transitions. Water quality update, all systems operational. Reminder, community unity is our strength. It was the digital version of a smile concealing a knife. Each email tried to reframe the situation. The dead trees were blamed on seasonal fungus. The sulfur smell was dismissed as temporary soil imbalance. And the drilling, that was described as a minor hydrological survey within the HOA perimeter in collaboration with county environmental advisors. There was no mention of me. No mention of the cut fence, the unauthorized drilling, or the lab results that now sat in my desk drawer under the heading, Geochemical Contaminant Alert, Immediate Risk to Soil Integrity. But what really boiled my blood was the last paragraph in one of their emails. Please do not engage with misinformation being circulated through unofficial channels or from parties not recognized as members of the HOA community. We encourage neighbors to stay informed through board-approved updates only. They were trying to erase me from the story, to paint me as some fringe element, a bitter outsider stirring the pot. Never mind that their crews had trespassed. Never mind that my land was now half dead and my well tainted. They wanted to flip the script, and they were doing it fast. By Monday, HOA board members were going door to door. I watched from my porch as Nancy Tillman, still in her trademark white blouse and pearl necklace, walked up to James's front door with a clipboard in hand and a plastic smile stretched across her face. She was there for damage control. James later told me they'd asked him to sign a community solidarity pledge, agreeing not to engage with or spread any unsubstantiated claims about the water survey or natural vegetation loss. He didn't sign, but others might have. Then came the landscaping crew. They didn't touch my property. Instead, they fanned out across the HOA lawns, ripping out dead hedges and trees, digging up the poisoned earth, and laying down new topsoil like that would fix anything. They worked fast, sloppy. In some cases, they just chopped down sick trees and left the stumps covering them with decorative mulch to hide the rot beneath. A layer of lies thin as bark. The kicker came Wednesday afternoon. I received a letter hand-delivered by a young man in a golf cart with the HOA logo on the side. He didn't say a word, just handed me a sealed envelope and drove off. Inside was a formal notice of nuisance, accusing me of interfering with HOA operations, harassing authorized contractors, and spreading false or inflammatory claims that damage community trust. It warned that continued behavior could result in legal action and civil fines. They were trying to silence me. They'd trespassed, polluted, lied, and now they wanted to frame me as the problem. I called Jack and read him the entire letter. He chuckled once, dry and sharp. Classic pre-litigation intimidation. Don't engage. Forward it to me. We'll respond through the channels they can't ignore. Then he got serious. We've got movement on our end. The Department of Natural Resources is interested. Quietly for now, but they want to review the water samples and incident footage. They're especially concerned about potential aquifer compromise. Good, I said, because the HOA's already rewriting the damn narrative. Jack's voice dropped lower. Then we'd better make sure the real story hits first and hits hard. That night, I sat at my old desk, poured myself a finger of rye, and wrote everything down. Every date, every lie, every dead tree and sulfur stench. I compiled photos, timestamps, emails, and video files. I organized it like a war report because that's exactly what it was now. A quiet war over truth. And I wasn't going to let them win it with smiles and newsletters. By Friday, I had a full report, a dossier really printed and ready to deliver to the county office and the local press. But before I could send it off, I got a knock on my door. It was Denise. Her eyes were red, her face pale, and she looked like she hadn't slept in days. They cut down the trees in my yard, she said. I stepped aside and she walked in clutching a folder of her own. Inside were photos taken just that morning. 2 magnolias uprooted, 1 sapling yanked out and replaced with a bush she hadn't approved. Her backyard garden, once lush, now looked stripped and barren. I told them to stop, she whispered. They said it was necessary remediation, but they never asked. I looked at her photos, then at mine. They're trying to bury the evidence, I said. She nodded. And the neighbors? They're scared. They're being told to stay quiet. That talking will jeopardize property values. I took a deep breath. Do you want to help me end this? She looked me in the eye and said yes. That night, we posted the first video. I uploaded a 10-minute cut of footage, drilling rigs, trespassing, sulfur sludge, dying trees, and a voiceover calmly explaining everything. We didn't use HOA names. We didn't accuse, just presented the facts, dates, and documents. The views were modest at first, a few hundred locals. Then it caught on in the state subreddit. Then the local news shared it on their Facebook page. By Saturday morning, it had 30,000 views. By Sunday, reporters started calling. The HOA tried to respond with a prepared statement, vague, deflective, filled with ongoing investigations and partnering with environmental agencies. But the footage was too clear, the rot too obvious, and the smell still there, still creeping. No amount of mulch could hide it now. They wanted to gaslight me into silence, but instead I lit a fire they couldn't contain. They thought I was just a cranky old man with too much time on his hands and a stubborn streak carved from granite. That was their first mistake. The second was assuming I didn't know how to fight back. What the HOA board never realized, what they never bothered to ask, was that before I retired to this slice of earth, I'd spent 26 years with the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. Half that time was spent managing water and infrastructure drilling protocols, aquifer impact studies, and disaster mitigation. I'd overseen cleanup operations in 3 post-flood zones and reviewed more geotechnical reports than most of these suburban tyrants had ever seen in their lives. I didn't just know how to document a breach. I knew how to build the kind of case that makes people resign. Back in my office, I dug out the heavy gray file box marked USACE Retired, untouched for over a decade. Inside were my federal certifications, clearance letters, and a binder labeled Hydrogeological Impact Protocols, Tier 2 Threat Classifications. I hadn't cracked that thing open since 2009, but the moment I flipped it to the sulfur intrusion section, muscle memory kicked in. What the HOA had done drilling into a subsurface sulfur deposit without mitigation plans, containment structures, or geological surveys wasn't just reckless. It bordered on environmental negligence. Worse, they'd done it on private land. My land. I printed off the relevant pages and cross-referenced them against the footage I had. Every sign of hydrogen sulfide exposure was there: leaf burn, root rot, surface bubbling, aquatic discoloration. My earlier water samples matched contamination profiles listed in EPA documents. And then I remembered something else, an old contact. Her name was Dr. Emily Harrow, used to be one of the top analysts in Colorado's Division of Water Resources. We'd met during a joint investigation in the late 90s after a small-town contractor dumped industrial runoff into a protected marsh. She was sharp, ethical, and took no prisoners. I still had her number. When she answered on the second ring, her voice was exactly as I remembered, brisk, no nonsense, with a slight southern lilt. Dalton McRae. Now there's a name I haven't heard in years. We caught up briefly, then I laid it out what the HOA had done, what the drillers hit the lab results, and how they were trying to blame me. She didn't laugh, she didn't hesitate. I want the samples, and I want a soil core taken from the south quadrant of your property. I'll send someone tomorrow. The next morning, a plain white truck rolled up with Colorado state plates and a single tech inside. Young guy, quiet, wearing a clean jacket that read DWR Field Division 3. He introduced himself as Thomas and asked for the coordinates. I led him to the spot behind the pasture, about 20 feet from the borehole the HOA had drilled. He set up a small rig, extracted a soil column, and packed it into a sealed case. You'll have your results in 5 to 7 business days, he said. I need it sooner. He gave a tight nod and promised to expedite it. That same day, Denise returned, this time with 2 more residents, James and a woman I didn't recognize named Barbara, who lived on the western cul-de-sac. All 3 had experienced the same pattern: trees, dying kids, sick basements, now reeking of sulfur. But they'd also noticed something else: HOA maintenance trucks digging in backyards, laying new piping, and removing topsoil without notice. They're trying to fix it without admitting fault, James said. They're erasing it, Barbara added. So we started organizing. We created a shared cloud folder and labeled it Operation Root Rot. Half as a joke, half as defiance. Everyone uploaded photos, videos, and screen captures of HOA emails. We collected over 40 individual files in 2 days, each documenting some kind of damage or cover-up. Meanwhile, the original video kept gaining traction. We passed 50,000 views by midweek. That's when the news station out of Denver, Channel 9, called for an interview. They wanted to do a story on suburban environmental negligence and asked to film on site. I agreed, but only if they included the sulfur contamination angle and showed the dying trees inside the HOA borders. They brought a small crew out the next morning. A cameraman, a field reporter, and a young intern who looked like he hadn't ever smelled anything worse than microwave popcorn before. When we walked down to the borehole, the stench hit them like a punch. The cameraman actually gagged. The segment aired that same night. HOA drilling gone wrong. Sulfur contamination alleged in Oak Summit. My face was on camera. So was Denise's. So was the borehole, the black sludge, the dying trees. They even ran footage of HOA landscaping crews removing stumps like they were scrubbing evidence off a crime scene. By Friday, the HOA cracked. They issued a letter to all residents admitting to a drilling-related miscalculation and promised to coordinate with environmental consultants to assess long-term risk. But nowhere did they mention the trespass, or me, or the sulfur. They were still playing defense. But now the tide had turned. The county supervisor called me personally. So did a lawyer from the Colorado office of Environmental Health. Both promised to look deeper into the HOA's actions. Jack confirmed that the DNR was now formally reviewing the drill incident under a Tier 2 environmental breach protocol. And just when I thought the week couldn't get any more surreal, I got a call from a man named Paul Sanderson. He was a land use attorney, had worked with agricultural landowners in water disputes across the state. "I saw your interview," he said. "You've got a good case, stronger than most I've seen. Trespass damage, unlawful drilling, environmental negligence. If you're thinking of pursuing action, I'd like to help." I didn't answer right away. I was standing outside, phone pressed to my ear, staring at the scorched remnants of a once beautiful sycamore that had shaded my barn for decades. Its bark was split open like a wound, and a strange yellow crust had formed where the roots met the soil. My land was sick, my well was dying, my peace was gone. But I wasn't powerless, and I wasn't alone anymore. The results came in early on. A Tuesday morning slipped into my inbox with a subject line so sterile it could have been missed. DWR Soil Analysis Report, site number 073A. I opened it before my second cup of coffee, still in the same boots I'd worn while showing Thomas the site. I read every line twice. Then again. Then a third time, slower this time, letting the numbers and phrases drill into me with more force than the rig that had started this whole nightmare. Hydrogen sulfide concentration, 8.3 mg/K. Ferrous sulfate levels, 12.5 mg/K. Soil pH, 3.9, critically acidic. Organic root, death, advanced and irreversible. Source of contamination, breach of deep sulfuric layer consistent with uncharted geologic formation. There it was. Scientific confirmation that what the HOA had drilled into wasn't some shallow water pocket or harmless strata. It was a sulfur vein, volatile, unstable, and entirely unsuited for surface disturbance. The borehole they'd punched through my pasture had unlocked a subterranean infection, and now it was bleeding into every inch of Oak Summit's manicured dream. Attached to the report was a short note from Dr. Harrow herself. "Dalton, this is serious. Your aquifer is compromised. Your land is the least of their worries. If they keep denying this, it's going to spread until someone gets very sick or much worse." And still the HOA hadn't shut the site down. The drill sat there unmoving, but untouched, like an idol of arrogance. The yellowed soil surrounding it had darkened further, now cracked in places, fissures forming in patterns that looked almost like veins. One of the landscapers I'd seen earlier in the week hadn't come back since he passed out on the job and was carted away in silence. I forwarded the report to Jack. He called me back within an hour, his voice electric. "This is gold," he said. "We've got them on record. The state can't ignore this. The Department of Public Health will want to conduct its own inspection, and when they do, they'll follow the paper trail straight into that boardroom." "Do it," I said. "Push it." "I already am. And I looped in Paul, your lawyer. He wants to build the case into a public nuisance and environmental negligence suit." "Good." They wanted to pretend it was seasonal fungus. Let's see how they explain toxic groundwater and acidic topsoil in court. By that afternoon, the story had already caught fire online. Channel 9's video segment had gone viral, racking up over 300,000 views and landing in local subreddits, HOA watchdog pages, and even national environmental forums. Comments flooded in from people in other states, folks who'd dealt with HOAs overstepping their bounds, destroying natural land, and weaponizing bureaucracy against homeowners. I wasn't just a cranky old man anymore. I was a symbol of what happens when the wrong people think they own everything around them. That evening, the HOA held an emergency meeting. Of course I wasn't invited, but Denise was. She showed up late at night with a USB drive and a stunned look on her face. "They're panicking," she said, sitting at my kitchen table, her tea forgotten in her hands. "They know about the soil report. Someone forwarded it internally." Nancy was furious. It looked like she was going to explode. They were talking about damage control and trying to frame the narrative before the agencies arrive. "Frame it how?" I asked. Denise shook her head. "They're planning to say the drill was never active, that it was exploratory only, and the alleged contamination predates the operation. They're going to claim the sulfur was already there." "Exactly." I pulled up a folder from my computer labeled Day Zero Raw Footage and clicked into a time-stamped video. The date was clear, the footage was sharp, and the sound of the drill boring into the earth was unmistakable. They won't get away with that, I said. Later that night, I uploaded a second video, this one focused entirely on the soil report. I showed the data, the conclusions, and a side-by-side of tree health across the borderline. I narrated it slowly, clearly, with the kind of gravity that didn't need anger anymore, just truth. I ended the video with one sentence. One, this isn't just about trees. It's about trust land and the consequences of unchecked authority. By morning, it had 100,000 views. And a subpoena, a real one this time. The Colorado Department of Public Health and Environment had launched a formal inquiry into Oak Summit's drilling activities. The subpoena included a demand for all documentation, internal correspondence, permits, contractor agreements, and environmental impact assessments from the HOA board. It was the beginning of the end. Meanwhile, the neighborhood kept wilting. The sycamores near the clubhouse collapsed entirely, one of them cracking the pavement in the parking lot and damaging a Mercedes parked beneath it. Lawn care crews were now wearing masks, and HOA residents were beginning to ask the question out loud. What did the board do? Some came to my door quietly, humbly. They apologized for ignoring the signs. They asked what they could do. And for the first time in weeks, I felt something I hadn't expected to feel again: community. The kind that isn't manufactured by newsletters and flower beds, but forged in truth and shared stakes. We formed a coalition. We called it the Oak Summit Restoration Committee. Not to clean up their mess, to hold them accountable for it. Barbara volunteered to collect testimonies. James mapped out affected areas. Denise coordinated legal updates. I gave interviews. We were just neighbors once. Now we were the resistance. The HOA board tried to hold another meeting, this time closed, no minutes, no residents allowed. But someone leaked the audio, and when Nancy was caught on tape saying, "We just need to keep the optics clean until the next election," the last thread snapped. By the end of the week, 2 board members had resigned. The drill was finally dismantled, and a notice appeared in everyone's mailbox. Due to unforeseen environmental complications, all hydrological operations initiated by the Oak Summit Board are hereby suspended pending further review. Unforeseen. That's what they called it. But we knew better. We had the soil to prove it. The day the state investigators arrived, I stood on my porch with a thermos of black coffee and watched their convoy roll in. 3 white SUVs with the seal of the Colorado Department of Public Health and Environment, emblazoned on the doors, a 4th truck from the Department of Natural Resources, and 1 marked vehicle with the County Environmental Enforcement Division. They weren't here to shake hands. They were here to build a case. I met them at the fence line. The lead investigator, a tall woman in a navy field jacket and mirrored sunglasses, introduced herself as Agent Moreno. She held out a warrant and a sealed directive authorizing access to the entire drilling site mine and the HOA's side. She was polite, professional, and utterly unswayed by the HOA's public relations fog. "Mr. McCrae," she said after reviewing my documents and video logs, "we've reviewed the soil report and initial footage. There's sufficient cause to investigate this as an unauthorized environmental disturbance and potentially a criminal trespass." I handed her the signed affidavit from Paul, my attorney, detailing the cut fence, the damage, and the absence of permission for entry onto my land. "I hope you brought cameras," I said, "because what you'll find out there hasn't changed. If anything, it's gotten worse." They spent the whole day inspecting. Hazmat suits, soil core drills, chemical testing kits. They brought in a portable water analyzer and sent one of their team down to the creek to collect samples from 3 separate locations. 2 of the officers walked the borderline, with GPS equipment mapping precisely where the HOA's contractors had operated. Every few minutes, someone took another picture of a decayed root, a discolored lawn, or a gaping hole where a tree used to be. By the time the sun set, they had enough evidence to fill 2 vans. Agent Moreno pulled me aside before leaving. "We've confirmed that the HOA's hired contractors never registered their equipment with the county. No permit applications, no geological survey filings, no insurance waivers for excavation beyond regulated depth. As far as the state's concerned, this was an illegal operation." She paused, then added, "You may want to prepare for court." I already was. Paul Sanderson had been working around the clock. With every new sample, every confirmed violation he built out our civil suit trespass property damage, unlawful excavation, environmental negligence, and malicious misrepresentation. He even found grounds for a claim under the Colorado Open Lands Protection Act, which specifically prohibits private developments from disturbing subsurface geological formations on land they don't own without formal consent and oversight. The potential penalties, 6 figures minimum. But what stung more than the dollars was the reputational collapse. The HOA had built Oak Summit on the illusion of control, order, prestige. Now the illusion had cracked. At the next public board meeting mandated by the state to be open to all residents, people came in droves. Not for free wine and cheese like the ones before. They came angry, confused, and armed with questions. And I came too. For the first time since the drilling started, I stepped foot into their bright, beige-painted clubhouse, only this time I wasn't alone. The board looked cornered. Nancy Tillman's makeup couldn't mask the exhaustion. Mark Fisher, the HOA's vice president, sat stiff as a statue. The secretary tried to begin the meeting with a scripted update, but the crowd didn't let her finish. What did you know about the drilling? Did you vote on this? Why didn't you notify us when the trees started dying? My daughter got sick. Are you going to pay her medical bills? Who gave you the right to trespass on that man's land? They tried to control the room, but it was too late. When they called for a motion to adjourn early, the room erupted. Then James stood up from the second row and called for a motion to dissolve the current board under Article 9 of the HOA Charter, a clause that allowed residents to remove leadership if gross negligence or misconduct could be demonstrated. He had copies of the soil report, the cease and desist orders, the video footage, and the lab analysis in hand. He wasn't bluffing. The vote passed, 76 to 24. 3 board members were removed on the spot. Nancy Tillman resigned that night. I got a letter the next morning, this one not from the HOA, but from a law firm. They represented a group of residents launching a Haitian class action suit against the former HOA board. Property damage, loss of land value, health impacts, emotional distress. They wanted to include me in the claim, but I declined. I had my own fight, and it was personal. Paul filed the civil complaint that Friday. The defendants, Oak Summit, HOA, Nancy Tillman, as acting president, Mark Fisher, and the unnamed contractor who operated the drilling rig. We included property surveys, video evidence, drone footage, expert testimony from Dr. Harrow, and copies of the backdated fake HOA permits uncovered by Linda from the county office. The filing made headlines, local news, then regional. Even a legal blog picked it up under the headline, "When Suburbia Drills Too Deep, One Man's Fight Against an HOA Gone Rogue." The HOA's new interim board tried to settle quickly, offering to pay for land restoration and legal fees in exchange for confidentiality. But it was never about money. Not really. I wanted acknowledgement, admission, a record that would follow every single one of them. So I said no. "We'll see you in court," Paul said on my behalf. Meanwhile, the land kept showing signs of stress. The grass never grew back around the borehole. The water in my old well had to be sealed. The trees, hundreds of them, remained skeletal silhouettes against the horizon. Nature doesn't forget a wound like that. But I wasn't broken. I replaced the well with a rainwater harvesting system. I worked with a local ecological group to introduce sulfur-tolerant plants to the edge of the property. I turned my pasture into a learning site school. Kids came by to study what happens when power is abused and the land is left to pay the price. And people started calling me something I didn't expect. Steward. They meant it as a compliment. But all I ever wanted was to be left alone. Still, I realized something. Fighting back wasn't just about protecting what's mine. It was about making sure no one else had to live through what I did. And the tides. They weren't just turning. They were washing the rot away. By the time summer rolled around, the Oak Summit neighborhood no longer resembled the brochure-perfect paradise it had once marketed itself to be. The rolling green lawns were replaced by brittle patches of straw-colored grass. The lush median trees that once framed the winding streets now stood naked, leafless, and gray, like wooden skeletons reaching up in protest. The HOA's pride, the so-called green dream they had built their identity on, was dying in front of their eyes. And everyone knew why. The sulfur hadn't just poisoned the soil, it had poisoned the trust. What once was a tightly controlled community, obsessed with appearances, and compliance had unraveled into factions. Residents divided themselves into those who still clung to denial and those who had accepted the truth and were furious that it had been hidden for so long. The deniers, mostly bored loyalists and real estate investors, tried to keep up the illusion. They hired private landscapers, imported sod, and sprayed perfume into their front yards to mask the smell of decay. But it was futile. Nothing they planted took root. Even artificial turf looked limp against the backdrop of scorched trees and yellow-stained pavement. Meanwhile, those who'd woken up to the damage began removing what was left of their poisoned hedges, installing drought-resistant native flora, and putting up signs that read things like, "My yard is healing, are you? No HOA cover-ups here." Truth grows where control dies. I was invited to speak at one of their weekend gatherings. About 30 people gathered in Barbara's backyard, some sitting on coolers and overturned planters, others standing in clusters with arms folded and eyes full of bitterness. I didn't give them a speech, I told them a story, my story. How I bought my land for peace and ended up at war. How I once thought I could ignore the HOA if I just stayed on my side of the fence. I told them that silence is a garden for corruption, and it will grow unless someone burns it down. There were tears that day, and applause, but most importantly, there was unity. Even those who had doubted me before now understood that this wasn't about trees anymore. This was about betrayal, about arrogance, about a system built on control finally cracking under its own weight. That's when the audits began. The county, emboldened by the public attention and state investigation, launched a full audit of Oak Summit's books. What they found was worse than we imagined. Over $240,000 in unaccounted maintenance contracts. Duplicate invoices to companies owned by one board member's cousin. Emergency funds funneled into a land beautification initiative that coincided exactly with the illegal drilling operation on my land. The story became a wildfire. Denver Post ran a weekend feature titled "Rot Beneath the Roots: How Oak Summit's HOA Dug Its Own Grave." The subtitle pulled no punches. Fraud, contamination, and the rise of community resistance. 2 former board members were subpoenaed. One of them, Mark Fisher, was seen leaving the courthouse with a paper bag over his head. The image went viral. His reputation was ruined. His real estate license was suspended pending further investigation. Nancy Tillman tried to save face by doing an interview on a local podcast. She claimed she was duped by bad contractors and never knew the drilling was unauthorized. But when the host asked her why the HOA had published internal memos discouraging residents from speaking to the press, she shut the interview down and walked out. The damage was done. Property values plummeted. Not just because of the contamination, but because of the lawsuits, the headlines, the chaos. Buyers backed out. Rentals stood empty. Even the HOA's legal counsel quit issuing a quiet but scathing statement about an environment of toxic liability and ethical compromise. The new interim board tried to stabilize things. They reached out to me twice. Once with a letter asking if I'd consider a cooperative restoration initiative to rebuild trust and heal the relationship between you and the community. I didn't respond. The second time, they offered a monetary settlement, again 6 figures, plus naming rights to the new community garden they hoped to build. That time I did respond. I wrote, "You want to name something after me, name the crater you left behind. Because until you admit what you really did, you haven't earned the right to plant anything." I never heard back. Meanwhile, my land had started to change, but not in the way theirs had. The sulfur had spread, yes, but I'd taken action early. I'd isolated the contaminated section, removed the topsoil, and begun replenishing it with compost and slow recovery planting. I worked with ecologists who knew how to bring back land from the brink, and slowly tiny sprouts began to push through. Wild sunflowers, aster, resilient prairie grass. It wasn't pretty yet, but it was real. I started documenting it, filming slow time lapses of the regrowth, pairing it with excerpts from the lawsuit quotes about land power and accountability. People watched, not just neighbors, but viewers from all over. Environmental groups reached out. A documentary crew asked if I'd be willing to be interviewed. I said yes, because their story had already collapsed. But mine was still growing. James came by one day, his little girl in tow. She carried a tiny potted seedling, her cheeks sun-kissed and serious. She looked at me and asked, "Can we plant this here? My mommy said your dirt is getting better." We knelt down near the edge of the boundary line, where HOA jurisdiction once claimed to reach, and together we dug a small hole. The soil was warm, soft. She placed the seedling in, gently pressed the dirt around it, and smiled. "It's gonna be a tree someday," she said. I nodded, watching the sun catch in her hair. "It already is." That night, I walked my land alone. No rigs, no contractors, no board members watching from across the fence. Just me, the smell of new earth, and the distant sound of crickets finally returning. Their green dream had collapsed under the weight of its own arrogance. But mine had just begun. I never wanted to be the center of anything. When I bought this land 15 years ago, it was because of what it wasn't. No traffic, no streetlights, no committee meetings, no neighbors knocking to measure my grass height, no rules about what I could hang on my porch. Just 5 open acres, the skeleton of an old barn, and the kind of silence you could lie down in. But after the drill, after the poison, after the lies and the lawsuits, that quiet I once craved had become something different. It wasn't a retreat anymore. It was a line I had drawn, a boundary not just on a map, but in principle. This land was mine, and now I was going to shape it on my terms. I started by rebuilding the fence. Not the flimsy wire one that the HOA's contractors had cut through like tissue paper, but something with weight cedar posts 6 feet high, anchored deep in concrete, spaced with thick slats of weather-treated timber. I carved the wood myself, burned the seal of my family name into the gate, McCrae Ridge. People noticed, not because it was flashy, it wasn't, but because it meant something, a declaration. This was not a place to be pushed, tricked, or quietly trespassed. The new HOA board, what was left of it, sent a letter asking if I'd consider removing the fence on the east side to maintain community visual cohesion. I sent it back with one sentence scribbled across the top. "The days of visual cohesion are over. Welcome to reality." Then I went further. I tore out the remnants of the old pasture fencing and replaced them with native windbreak rose, choke cherry service berry lilac. I built raised beds for vegetables and added bee boxes near the far edge of the field. A solar array went up behind the barn. I dug a trench and installed French drains to direct runoff away from the poisoned corner of the land, now cordoned off with warning signs and flag markers. I didn't try to hide the damage. I documented it. At the edge of that ruined patch, where the soil still hissed faintly with traces of sulfur, I placed a bench. Just a simple one. On a small stone plaque embedded at its feet, I carved in capital letters, "Here lies what power forgets, the land remembers." The press came back. So did the YouTubers. The activists, even a handful of local college students doing a semester-long research project on the long-term impact of suburban drilling gone wrong. I let them film. I let them test. I let them talk. And I answered every question. One afternoon, while giving a tour to an environmental law professor and her students, a young man asked me, "Why didn't you just sell and leave?" I looked at the ground before I answered. Because leaving would have been easier, and that's what they counted on. That I'd fold. That they'd bury what they did under mulch and excuses. But the ground doesn't forget. And neither do I. Later that evening, Paul called. "The court date's been finalized," he said. "We'll go before a judge in 2 weeks. I've already been contacted by counsel for the HOA's insurance company. They want to settle." I leaned against the porch rail, the sun dipping low behind the horizon. "How much?" They're offering $375,000 and a full written apology from the board. Public record. No NDA, no gag order. I didn't answer right away. The number sounded big. But no dollar amount would ever replace the tree line I lost, the poisoning of my soil, or the months of being gaslit by a system designed to protect itself. Still, the idea of that apology in writing, signed and notarized for the whole town to read. "Take it," I said. "But I want one more condition." "What's that?" "I want a clause written into the settlement that the HOA can never, under any circumstance, claim jurisdiction over my land again. Not even symbolic. No voting rights, no flags, no petitions. I don't exist on their map." There was silence on the line. Then Paul said, "Consider it done." That evening, Denise stopped by with a mason jar of pickled okra and a folded newspaper in her hand. "You've seen this?" she asked. She handed me the Oak Summit Community Bulletin. It was a reprint of the HOA's apology letter, part of the settlement terms. The Oak Summit Homeowners Association formally apologizes to Mr. Dalton McCrae for the unauthorized actions taken on his property, including unpermitted drilling, environmental disturbance, and miscommunication with the community. We acknowledge the damage caused and commit to transparency moving forward. Below it in small italicized print. The HOA waives any present or future claim over McCrae Ridge in perpetuity. I smiled, not because it was over, but because now the story couldn't be rewritten. That weekend, neighbors held a cookout in the cleared community garden plot. I was invited, though I never set foot inside the HOA boundary. But people came out to my place afterward. James brought sweet tea, Barbara brought lemon bars. Kids ran through the tall grass, chased each other along the gravel drive, shouted and laughed, without looking over their shoulders for someone with a clipboard and a rule book. As night fell, I sat under the stars and watched the wind ripple through what used to be a battlefield. Not of bullets, but of principle. And I realized something simple, something powerful. They had tried to turn my land into a liability, but I had turned it into legacy. My land, my terms. Autumn came soft and golden that year, with long streaks of sunlight filtering through the few surviving trees, and a breeze that carried more memory than chill. By then, it had been nearly a full year since the HOA first rolled their rigs onto my land, uninvited, unaccountable, and for a while, unchallenged. But now things were different. The drill was long gone. The borehole filled in and capped with concrete under state supervision, marked and recorded as a permanent geological risk zone. The poisoned corner of my property remained cordoned off dead soil, a stark reminder of how deep ignorance can go when power is unchecked. But everything else was beginning to breathe again. Where sulfur once soaked into the roots, native grasses now reached up, stubborn and green. The soil I'd amended and turned by hand had started producing again, modestly, but honestly. Rows of hardy vegetables sprouted in the raised beds. Bees buzzed lazily between wildflowers that dotted the edge of the pasture. Even the birds had returned their morning songs, no longer drowned out by the mechanical hum of machines or the silence that followed them. The land was healing, and so was I. The court case officially closed 2 weeks after the settlement. No trial, no appeals, just a document with all the signatures and a final check that cleared into a fund I created specifically for land restoration and community environmental education. I named it Rootline. Because if there was one thing I learned, it's that the real battles always happen underground, unseen, until it's too late. But Rootline wasn't just for me. We built an open-air classroom on the far end of my property, 5 benches, a gravel path, and a wooden canopy made from salvaged beams from the old barn. Local schools started bringing kids out for field trips. They'd sit there under the Colorado sky with notebooks in hand, while guest speakers, soil scientists, conservationists, even Jack once or twice taught them about aquifer stewardship and the cost of carelessness. One afternoon, a boy about 10 years old raised his hand and asked, "Why didn't the HOA just say sorry before it got so bad?" I didn't have an easy answer, but I told him the truth. Because when people build their world on control, admitting they were wrong feels like losing everything. But saying sorry isn't weakness. It's the first step to growing something better. The kid nodded, scribbled in his notebook, and went back to watching the bees. Meanwhile, the former HOA board members all vanished from public life. Nancy Tillman sold her home and left the state. Mark Fisher lost his license and his reputation. The rest scattered quiet exits, no fanfare. The new interim board, to their credit, enacted a full charter rewrite. They eliminated forced landscaping uniformity, instituted transparency rules, and formed a homeowner oversight council. They even banned any future projects involving land outside HOA ownership. Imagine that. It only took a sulfur disaster, 3 lawsuits, and half a forest dying to get them to respect a boundary. But the most unexpected justice came from the neighbors themselves. I started receiving letters, handwritten, heartfelt, from residents who'd once glared at me from behind steering wheels or avoided eye contact in town. Some apologized. Some just said thank you. One man wrote, "I used to think you were just angry. Now I understand you were right. You saved more than your land. You saved ours too." Those letters I kept in a box beside the fireplace. Not for ego, but for grounding. Because even after the fight, even after the win some nights, I'd still wake up tense, dreaming about the smell of sulfur, or the sound of that drill splitting the earth. Trauma has roots too. You just don't always see them. But the peace came back. Not the old kind, the naive peace of assuming people will do the right thing if you leave them be. No. This peace had been earned. This peace had scars. This peace could defend itself. I spent that winter finishing the greenhouse. It was modest, just 12 feet long, tucked behind the barn, but it caught the morning light perfectly. The first tomato plant I started there grew fast and strong. I named it Nancy, a little joke between me and the soil. By spring, McCrae Ridge was blooming. We held a planting ceremony in April, exactly 1 year, from the day the HOA's rig first dug into my pasture. Dozens of people came. Some brought seeds. Others brought food. James grilled hot dogs. Denise handed out wildflower bulbs. Even Barbara, who now sat on the new board's ethics committee, gave a short speech, gracious, humble, honest. And when it was time, we all knelt together and placed the seedlings into the earth. My hands shook a little as I pressed soil around mine, a cottonwood, tall and thin, and just beginning to leaf. I knew it would outlive me. That's why I chose it. Afterward, a little girl from the neighborhood, maybe 5 or 6, ran up and asked if I was the man who stopped the poison. I laughed, then crouched down beside her. No, I said. I'm just the man who didn't look away. She gave me a hug. No questions, no ceremony. Just that simple, clear-eyed gratitude only a child can give. It undid me. That night, I sat on the porch, a dog at my feet, stars overhead, and thought about everything this land had endured. Everything we had endured. And I thought about how justice isn't always loud. It doesn't always come with headlines or settlements. Sometimes justice is quiet. Sometimes it grows in silence. Sometimes it's a tree reaching for the sun on land no longer claimed by fear but by truth. And when I leaned back, closed my eyes, and breathed in the cool night air, I didn't smell sulfur anymore. I smelled grass.